second time's the charm. Second time's the charm.
Sure.
For the record, everybody, we've done this once before, and Zoraida was amazing, and we were not. And then I lost the file. So it's on me. Hello, I'm Sarah McLean. I write romance novels, and I read romance novels, and I'm not good at audio files.
I'm Jennifer Prokop. I am a romance reader and critic, and I'm super excited about having a second chance at a very important topic. And our guest today
is Zoraida Córdova. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi. Zoraida, thank you for joining us. You're in Puerto Rico right now.
I am in Puerto Rico. I put all my stuff in storage in the beginning of the year, or the end of last year, and I was like, "Peace out, New York. See you soon."
Was that just because you were like, I cannot sit in my apartment one more second during a pandemic? Because that is how I feel.
Because my brother and I were living together. We've been living together for years, but I have a 1-bedroom. He lives in my living room. When the pandemic started, usually he went to work every day, and we saw each other like when he came home at night, or he stayed at his girlfriend's house, but in the evenings. And that was no longer possible when it's like, oh, we're both home and we have to quarantine together. And
look,
I love you
to each other's faces.
Yeah, in a 1-bedroom. So I finally got sick of it. My uncles have an apartment in Puerto Rico that they don't live in anymore. Neither of them are Puerto Rican, but like, one of my uncles bought the property in the 80s, and it's just been here. And now I was like, hey, can I go right there for a few months? And they were like, sure, you just have to pay for your own internet. And I was like, great.
I can do this.
Sold.
Yeah, it's amazing. And
yeah, I'm also out of contract. So I'm like, let me just go do this while I figure out another book to write.
So like, are you pandemicking there? How does it feel there?
It feels.
Did you get the shot?
I got my first shot.
I've seen her Instagram and it looks beautiful. That's what you need to know.
Yeah, no, it's gorgeous.
Like, oh, so beautiful.
Yeah, so the locals are taking it very, very seriously because there's a limited access to hospitals. There's one island in Puerto Rico called Vieques, and like they have like a handful of ferries that go back and forth, and usually tourists take up so much of it, and there's no hospital in that island. There are a lot of tourists who were behaving really badly during spring break, like shirts off, screaming in the streets, no masks. So it's been interesting just watching tourist culture during a pandemic, because it's like people leave and they come to this island and they're like, okay, I left coronavirus behind in the United States. But one, this is still the United States technically, because it's a colony essentially. And two, the pandemic is still here.
Right.
But the beaches are safe because,
outside,
according to the CDC, right? Lots of wind. And so that's been really nice to be able to just take walks and think and, agonize.
Well, just being outside. I'm living your New York City life here, and it still feels like I have both shots now, and I still feel like trapped in my house with these people.
Same. I've been fully vaccinated for 6 weeks, and I'm still like, I'm going to just stay home. It's fine. Although I did go to a bar last week for the first time with a couple people after work on Friday, and it was so nice. Someone brought me a nachos and then took them away.
Someone brought you nachos
and a Moscow Mule in like the actual Moscow Mule cup. Right?
Oh my God, that sounds beautiful. I can't wait to go. I have yet to go to like a bar by myself. I had a couple of friends visit me. One of my best friends, who's a romance literary agent, she stayed with me for a month and worked remotely. And we would go to some restaurants, but yeah, I really miss social gatherings so much.
Same.
Well, this is like a social gathering.
It is.
It's actually nothing like that, but we're looking at each other, so that's a thing.
Close.
Zoraida, you are here to talk about fantasy romance because you write fantasy romance.
Yeah, I listened to one of your other episodes, the one where you answer questions.
Yeah.
And I know that you had somebody ask about
yes,
fantasy romance.
what are we doing? Why don't we have more of it? I think is the big question. Before we get into it, I want to talk about Zoraida because
Yes.
we're obviously going to talk about her books, but I want to talk about her as like, you know, a person and also about how I basically forced her to know me, which everybody who listens to the podcast knows that this is what I do to people.
And her amazing romances. So some of which are not fantasy, right? So you've written, I mean,
Well,
you're like a triple threat. You could write anything you want.
She's great at everything and also very fast. Like it's a lot to take in, Zoraida. She's very good and she writes really fast and she writes in all sorts of genres. She's just, yeah. But I found Zoraida through her contemporaries back in the day. Like now it feels like those were a million years ago.
2016. Yeah, they're actually not
2016. They're not a million years ago.
No,
feels
it's
that
actually
way, though.
before that. It was 2014 for sure.
Okay, that feels better.
That feels better. Those books are not available anymore except for audio.
Oh, interesting.
Well, so you can listen to them on audio. The two that I really love are Luck on the Line, which is about an arrogant chef, and everybody knows that I love an arrogant chef.
Mm-hmm.
And the daughter of like a
Sexy Martha Stewart.
yes, Martha Stewart style, you know, mom.
Sexy.
And
Sorry,
the
I'm still like having a sexy Martha Stewart moment. But I'm fine. I'm totally fine, everybody.
Guess it's like Kris Jenner was Martha Stewart.
Yeah, that is actually perfect. If they made a baby, it would be this mom. And then the other one, but the one that I think I read first probably was Life on the Level, which is the third one in that series. And the heroine has a gambling addiction and is going to rehab. And she has like a one-night stand the night before she enters rehab for gambling addiction with the counselor at the rehab center.
Listen.
And now listen, I mean, Adriana Herrera right now is going, that's not okay. But like,
is it even a romance novel one night stand if it's not with like your boss, your coworker, your therapist the next day?
Oh no. I will say he's not her.
Technically her. I know you're very careful. He's not technically
He's
her
a counselor. It's still not allowed.
Well, I'm for it. As everyone knows, I like a doctor-patient romance.
I'm the doctor. You wait on the waiting list. Patient's been here since this morning. I dismiss.
Don't at me.
Mm-hmm.
But that is where, so that's where it began, my love affair for Zoraida's books. And then you wrote more contemporaries as Zoey Castile. You wrote the Happy Endings series, which began with Stripped and ended with Hired and Flashed, which Flash is the end. Hired, Stripped, Hired, Flashed. And those were all about men who were adjacent to sex work. Some of them were more sex worky than others.
You know who sent me that book is Norma at Kensington.
That's my editor.
And I don't know if we've ever said Norma at Kensington is she just like the most amazing person in real life? She just seems like the most amazing person.
She's like a joy bomb.
She is.
She's a joy fairy. She is like a fairy godmother to a lot of books, specifically like Latino romance or POC romances. She's so exuberant and she loves stories and loves her authors. And so I think I was her first acquisition.
Wow, that's so cool.
I feel very special.
I saw her at RWA and I just thought we'd have plenty of time together. And we just did that thing at each other where I was like, Norma! And she was like, Jen! And then we went our separate ways. And now I'm like, one day I'll be back.
But of course
in
she
New
sent it
York.
to you because she was like, you got to read these like
amazing
this like stripper book.
And I was
which
like,
was
you're
basically
right, I
like
do.
Magic Mike fanfic.
It was. That's what I called it.
I mean, I'm really for it.
That's how I pitched it, I think. I was like, it's Magic Mike XXL fanfic.
What's wild? So you wrote these 6 contemporaries, which would have taken me 6 years. And instead, you wrote these 6 contemporaries and then you wrote like 20 to 30 other books at the same time.
I am very prolific.
Yeah. So you're writing, so you wrote all these contemporaries and then you were writing, you've written fantasy, YA fantasy, adult fantasy, Star Wars tie-ins.
Yeah.
Is that
My Star Wars, I write middle grade. If you have, if you're a romance reader, but you have children, I have middle grade. I have one middle grade out with Scholastic, and I'm currently working on the second middle grade, which is called Valentina Salazar is Not a Monster Hunter. And that's basically like, I wanted to take Supernatural, the TV show, and gender bend it and have like sisters and one brother monster hunting around the country.
I'm going to pencil you in for my class because I'm a middle school teacher. So I'm all like, yeah, come talk to my students. It's amazing. But let's talk about fantasy.
But like fantasy is where your heart lies, right?
Fantasy is where I started. So I started with a novel called The Vicious Deep, and that was mermaids in Coney Island. It's a teenage boy discovers, essentially he was like Ariel's son and has to quest to become the next Sea King, right? And so after that trilogy, I started writing. My agent basically dared me to write a romance novel because I kept saying, like, I kept talking about it, and she was like, well, then just shut up and do it. I dare you. And I, never resist the dare.
Wait, can I pause on this mermaid thing? Because I'm having a flashback to a time when you and I did a panel together and there was a lot of discussion about where mermen kept their penises.
Yeah, there's a line.
That's in your book.
That's in my teen fiction novel, yes. Mm-hmm. My main character.
That's a good question.
It's a 9-year-old boy, and he has a guardian, and his guardian, he's like, okay, I turned into a merman. Turns to his guardian, who's like, yo, bro, where does it go? Where does, and his guardian's like, don't worry, there's a pocket. And so that was like, I created the Hot Pocket, which Guillermo, not Guillermo, is it Guillermo?
Yeah, in Shape of the Water.
The Shape of the Water. He used my same mermaid anatomy theory.
Well, maybe he's a fan.
Has
that occurred to you?
I spent too much time thinking about how cryptids fuck.
I like it. It's important. This is the thing. We're going to get to world building, and I think it's important to know where the penis is.
It absolutely is important to know where the penis is.
Okay, so I cut you off though.
So I started. My agent essentially dared me to write romance, and I started writing. At that point, the romance books that I had mostly read were pretty much Nora Roberts.
Were you a fic writer before?
Like fanfic?
Did you come through fanfic?
No. I actually have never read fanfiction.
Same.
Me neither.
But some people come through that now.
Yeah, right. It's a really common pathway.
It's a very common thing. I mean, I've never read it. I just don't know why. I think that maybe it's the author in me, but I'm happy to accept the ending that a lot of people give me, even if it's a tragic one, right? Like I fucking hate the way Buffy the Vampire Slayer ends Buffy and Angel, right? But it's fine. It's a character journey.
I'm going to say something off topic. I really believe that if I could get AO3 on like my Kindle as opposed to on like a computer screen, I would probably read it. I really think it's like a formatting issue for me. And I know that sounds bananas. But when I look at like fanfic and it's just like on a screen and kind of scrolling forever, I'm just like, meh. I don't know.
The format's really well. I did go onto AO3 once because somebody told me that there was a Raylo fanfic that I needed to read. And it just wasn't meant to be because I didn't have internet that day or something happened. I was in the mountains and
You need a guide too. I think if you find someone who's like, these are the ones to read, then you can dive.
You need Adriana.
Right, absolutely.
Tell you what stucky fanfic to read. She just sends you links and you read that.
My journey through starting out writing YA romance, YA urban fantasy, what I consider to be urban fantasy, and shifting to things like contemporary romance. I have a magical realism adult novel coming out in September called The Inheritance of Orchidea Divina. Writing a love story for Star Wars. I feel like my journey has been into realizing that what I actually want to write about is our love stories and romance set in magical worlds. And I just need to get a publisher to let me write it exclusively. Because the more I write books, the more romance I put into my YA and adult, adult romance is a given because that's,
Sure.
that's we know that that's what the plot is. But I have been craving more high fantasy with romance as the main plot. And people, every time I ask for suggestions, people give me the same books, and I'm like, that has one romantic scene in it. You don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Well, so already we have like I think it'd be really important to have like a definition kind of phase of the podcast, right? So
Yes.
You've mentioned urban fantasy and high fantasy, and then there's paranormal. So one reason I think romance readers get a little confused is that all is the same, or they don't know how to ask for what they want. So
Sure.
Can you talk to us about some of those genre definitions?
Yes. There are a lot of subcategories to what fantasy is. And I think all of it is under the umbrella of speculative fiction. Speculative fiction was coined, I'm pretty sure it was coined by Robert Heinlein in like 1950 or 1940, end of 1940s, whatever. And he wrote Starship Troopers. And I really loved that movie as a kid because I felt naughty watching it because men and women showered together and there was like a sex scene like under the covers, and like I really wanted that couple to be together, and then also like guns and bugs in space, right? So like that was that like I should have known that this is what I wanted. So speculative fiction just asks the question, what if hobbits were real? What if vampires were real? What if we colonize the moon and whatever. So that goes into science fiction, which is a world with technology, right? Aliens, robots, things like that. Science fantasy, which is more like space opera. Star Wars, Star Trek is more. So like if you think about it, Star Trek, science fiction. Star Wars, science fantasy, because it's like, give me the hydro space carburetor and put it in, whatever. That's how I wrote my Star Wars novel. And then you go to things like dystopian, right? Like all of that is sci-fi. And then when you move into the fantasy section of speculative fiction, you have sword and sorcery, high fantasy, epic fantasy, the Lord of the Rings, The Witcher, Shadow and Bone. And then you have things like low fantasy or contemporary fantasy and urban fantasy, which sort of fit in the same place, which is just like the real world with a magical overlay. And then within that, urban fantasy to me is like New York with magic. That's the Vicious Deep trilogy. That's my Brooklyn Bruja series.
So like literal urban centers
yes.
with magic.
There's some conversation around this, which has changed over the last few years, where more authors of color, specifically Black authors, call it contemporary fantasy because urban fantasy sort of ignores the like real life issues like race and things like that, right? Like True Blood doesn't really deal with race. It's not really urban because it takes place in like the South,
middle of nowhere.
South.
Yeah.
But authors like L.L. McKinney and Bethany C. Morrow, who are YA authors writing about mermaids and demons in the real world, they call it, but about Black protagonists, young Black girls facing problems like magical problems. They also don't want the stigma of being called urban, because in romance, am I correct in saying that there's like urban romance was considered like
Black urban
romance.
fiction? Right. Is right.
Yeah, exactly. So they don't want to be called that, rightly so, right? There's like the stigma of that. So they call it contemporary fantasy. Both of those to me are correct for my work. And then magical realism and fables and fairy tales, those things are also fantasy to me. And then dark fantasy, which combines horror into the fantasy world.
Like who? Give us an example of that.
Dark fantasy, something I would call like Pan's Labyrinth or Crimson Peak, things like that.
Can I
Guillermo del Toro's like entire oeuvre.
Yeah, his
That's
so
oeuvre. Can I ask a question? So everybody knows I'm a middle school teacher, and like talking about genres is sort of like right, and sort of sometimes I talk about speculative fiction and then science fiction versus fantasy. And one way that's kind of easy to kind of explain it to kids is like science fiction is about technology and fantasy is about magic. Does that feel true, or do you think like that's...
No, that feels true.
Okay.
That feels true. They're both speculative fiction, but that's why Star Wars is in such a strange place as a space opera.
Sure.
Because it has
you have the Force
size fantasy. Yeah, the Force is magic.
But you also have, warp speed
Space
or
wizards.
whatever. Right, sure. Well, because so many things are not purely one or the other. A lot of things can combine, right?
Right. A lot of things mash up genres.
Right.
And if you look at something like
the Avengers.
Fonda...
Or the Marvel Universe or whatever.
The Marvel Universe. Fonda Lee has a series called Jade City, which she calls like a kung fu contemporary fantasy, where it's like mobs, mobster families who use this like jade magic. But it's very, very like modern: cars, cell phones, internet, like political borders. Like it's very modern, but it's still high fantasy because the countries are all made up.
I think when I think of high fantasy, I think like I'm going to need a map for this.
Yeah, you do need a map. Absolutely. It's just not in medieval times.
This is where like how much in the dark I am on discussing fantasy. I'm like, well, there's books that I need maps for and books that I don't need maps for.
I was talking to a couple of like women in my book club, and I was sort of like, one of the things that sometimes frustrates me about fantasy is I was like, they're always like walking around everywhere. Like, why are like it's always a road trip, right? And one of the things, it's a quest. And one of the things that Kat said in my book club is, and then I felt like the dumbest person ever. She's like, well, of course, because in a good fantasy, like the landscape is a character. And you want to show it off. And the only way you can do that is having people be like walking around through it or traveling through it. And I was like, oh, that totally makes sense.
But I know about one thing I got to do. Around the lawn. Another time is now. Sing my song. I'm going around the world. I gotta find my girl.
I would love to see maps in contemporary fiction, right? Like historical contemporary. I don't know shit about like Regency England. I need a map to show me where this Kensington Gardens is and Bath and all these places. Like, I need a map. Give me a map.
I love a map, period, honestly. You want a map.
I want a map in your next book because I'm like, where are they? I'm like, everything takes place in London, right? Like,
yeah, right.
I mean, it's fine.
Well,
who cares?
Back to being a middle school English teacher. Like,
winding roads, lots of buildings.
Reading strategies are for everyone. And there's a reason why, like, maps can help us, like, place characters in time and space. But I love that idea of, like, in a really good fantasy, the world itself is a character. So you want to show it off.
The world should be a character, but also your world should make sense without having that map in the front, right? Like you have to be able to explain the different countries and the different, Shadow and Bone is an example of this. Since the movie's out, I feel like the TV show's out. I feel like I can talk about that more. Leigh Bardugo creates very distinct cultures that are not just like generic fill in the blank European centric, like Andalasia, made up words. She has language roots and society like expectations and cultural codes and things like that.
So interestingly, can we talk a little bit about maps? Because I do feel like you have a map in your most recent
Illusionary.
book.
Yeah. Illusionary Incendiary.
And it's a map of New York City.
Where? What? Where?
Wait, no.
Oh,
yes.
My Brooklyn Brewhouse series.
In Brooklyn, not in Illusionary.
Yeah. My Brooklyn Brewhouse series, the book Bruja Born, the second book, has a map of New York City.
And now, why? Yeah. Why?
Because I wanted to show where the magical points were. Also, I had a map in book 1, and I knew I was going to have a map in book 3, so I wanted to be consistent.
Right.
And in the book, there's a scene where they're looking at a map of New York to look at where all the zombies are. So like Bruja Born is basically like, it's not an anti-love story, but it's like a self-love story, right? The book starts off with the line like, this is a love story. And then it progresses to like, this is not a love story. This was never a love story. And, it's about letting go of toxic relationships through the metaphor of like, this girl turns her boyfriend into a zombie, along with like dozens of other New Yorkers. And so in the map, you can see like where the hordes of zombies are. And I was like, it would be cool to show that in the print book and to sort of see where they're going. Because I feel like for people outside of New York, when you're like, and then they took the A train and the G train and the whatever train.
Right. Well, it's
and
like London. You don't know. And
yeah,
how could you know?
exactly.
So
I thought that was important.
Do you start we're going to get into world building, I feel like, a little bit with this, because Jen, you have you're like, no, I'm not ready.
I'm not ready. I really feel like before we do that, I really want to talk about the difference between fantasy and paranormal. And maybe it'll come later, but I feel like when
I was saving it for later.
Okay, then perfect. Let's do it later.
Let's bring it in later when we're talking about sex.
Perfect.
Okay.
So I was listening to Sarah Ennie's podcast the other day, and she had Victoria Aveyard on, who wrote The Red Queen, and has a new book out this month. So, and one of the things that she was talking about is, when she sits down and she starts with the world, she like builds the map. She writes high fantasy, so she, builds the map first and thinks about, in the way that you were talking about, Lee Bardugo, like thinks about what does the landscape look like? What are the cultures like in all these places? How are the borders drawn relating to mountains and rivers and whatever? And I'm sort of curious about, and so I think this is why often in writing, when we talk about world building, and this is true when people go to writers' conferences, there's always like 1 or 2 workshops that are on world building. And when you're a baby writer, often you say, oh, well, I'm not writing fantasy, so I don't need to go to that one. And I think that often we writers make the mistake of those of us who don't write fantasy make the mistake of saying like, that's a problem for people who write something other than what we write. And that, we all know that's not true. So could you talk a little bit about world building and what we can all learn from fantasy?
Absolutely.
In that way? Maybe start with your own style and then.
Yeah. So when I world build, I actually start with character first, right? Victoria Aveyard, her first series was dystopian. So it was like, it used to be America in the past, but now it is the future and we call it something else and there's magic. But in my books, I start with a character, and the character tells me as much as I'm going to know about the world in that first instance of thinking of them. So my mermaid series, I was in Coney Island and I was at the beach and there was a very handsome, cute lifeguard who was around my age. I think I was like 20. And I thought, what if he was a merman? And then that spiraled into Coney Island has all of this like mermaid words and like, the streets, mermaid lore all over the place. The mermaid parade. Every street is named after something aquatic. And then I thought, what if the reason is because like every so years, the mermaids return to Coney Island. And if they return, what are they here for? And what if this time they return early and they come for that lifeguard? And what is that lifeguard's name? And what is his story? And that is literally, that was my train of thought when I came up with this book. And because I world build from character up, which a lot of my contemporaries and other friends, they started with world first and then moved to character. But the reason I start with character is because this is the person that's going to carry me through the narration, through the quest. This is their story, and I believe that your character at the beginning of the story, they are being influenced by the world, but by the end of the story, they should be doing the influencing. They should be the one making change. And like, that's the whole point of this, right? We're going on a hero's journey. So the hero has now learned all this stuff about the world. And then they in turn use all that knowledge to save the day and create change. And so that's why I start with character first. But I also have to ask myself, N.K. Jemisin, who is, you both are nodding, so you know exactly.
Yes.
N.K. Jemisin has a lecture on her website where she has something called the cultural iceberg.
Oh, yeah. This is a really cool thing. Yeah.
And the cultural iceberg shows that culture is like an iceberg. There are things that you see on the surface, skin tone, hair, clothing, right? And then there are the things that are surface level, right beneath that. And when you're building a fantasy world, you have to answer all these things like, my current fantasy novel, Illusionary, which is the sequel to Incendiary. It's inspired by 15th century Spain. So I had to ask myself, like, in this world inspired by ancient Spain, like, what do people eat? How do they communicate love? How do they say please and thank you? How do they show class? How do they, like, if they only eat a X diet, where does this meat come from? Who are the people farming this? If they haven't invented a specific color, what is the actual color that like royalty wears versus what peasants wear? And how does their geography affect what is farmed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I can't call it New World Fantasy and then have things like tomatoes and corn and potatoes and things like that, right? Because that's all the New World,
right?
And so that's how my brain works when I'm world building.
No, but I think this is so fascinating because I think starting from character is, it's how I work too, which is why whenever I hear a fantasy author say like, well, I build the map first, I have to look at what the world looks like first. I'm like, why?
Yeah.
Because for me, it feels like, well, why don't you just put a river where you need a river?
Exactly. That's what I do.
And like draw it into your map.
After that, I figure out, like, I have a very old geography textbook, whatever the one with like topography is. That's how much I read it. And I look up like, well, how are rivers formed? And so if I do need a river, I shift the landscape to the way that I need the story to move, which is what I did with Labyrinth Lost. When I wrote Labyrinth Lost, this girl casts a curse to like get rid of her powers, but instead she gets rid of her family and sends them to another dimension, has to go to that other dimension to get them back. And so the journey, I knew what I needed. I wanted it to feel like a descent into like, her own personal hell. And I just put everything where I needed to be put. Like, it's my, I'm the writer. Like, I'm not going to let mountains dictate me.
I think it's really important, though, to say that as a reader, I guess I would say it's clear to me that people really can tell if the world building is not careful, right? So I had someone, like a book I loved, someone was like, yeah, I couldn't read that. Like, they stopped to eat eggs, but it was like 1,000 years in the future. And I was like, okay, fair enough. I didn't even think about it. But I really do think that like readers who care deeply about world building are going to really tune in, not just to like sort of, paying attention to that cultural iceberg, but the things that don't make sense together, or like the holes in the world building, right? The way that it's sort of just using something else. And I think that must be really fun as an author to like be, I don't know, like poking your own world and seeing where you have to like build up more or take away, or, you probably do entire things that then don't make it into the book, but that they're there.
Yeah. I look at something even show, you have to like a very specific kind of, and messy world building sounds rude, but that's what it is, right? It's messy world building. Something like The Witcher, which I don't believe that the books do this. I haven't read the books yet. I started reading one and I was like, opening chapter, he's having sex with a prostitute. And I was just like,
I'm done.
I'm all right.
Yeah.
I'll just watch Henry Cavill.
Henry Cavill's thighs do the work for you.
No, fine. But like in that show, there's a race of elves, but the race of elves have like random Black people and random Indian people and like everyone is whatever race, but that doesn't make sense to me because humans are already separated by race. So how come the elves are not? And so it doesn't answer the questions that I feel like somebody should have been asking from the beginning, right? Like, where do these elves actually come from? So it doesn't do that world building. And it's a little messy, but I still enjoy the show.
Right.
Right. So it doesn't completely pull me off. Whereas you watch something like Game of Thrones, which even though it's like problematic in the way if it's depiction of brown people, it still creates it still creates distinct cultures that can be separated from each other. And so, like, there's like an incestuous blonde person, that's a Lannister.
Right.
Right. There's a dark-haired, tan man in leathers. That's a Dothraki, right? Like, it creates boundaries.
Right.
And I don't think that's a failure of imagination. I think that that's smart world building. And you have to like a certain kind, like another author said this, like, I don't know where, but she said, like, you have to like a certain kind of mess to just enjoy shows where those questions aren't answered, right? And that's fine. Like, sometimes I love watching fantasy movies where the special effects are not good, and I'm like, well,
there's
why
just
didn't they just do
dragons
that?
and it's fine.
Yeah. And so it's fine. But I think that the more an author pays attention to things like that, the more I feel invested in the book.
But another big like discussion, I guess, with fantasy is how some authors can really thoughtlessly reproduce like colonialist ideas or racist ideas. I mean, so I do think it's also, if it's in your world and you haven't thought about why, then chances seem pretty good that you might be doing something harmful. And there's been a lot of, in YA especially, people who, the book just doesn't make it because advanced readers get a look at it and are like, what are you doing?
From somebody, I think that there was a call for diverse fantasy years ago when We Need Diverse book first started in 2014 for diverse fantasy. And I think that the answer to that was things like, let me just reproduce our current prejudices, put a knife or put a sword into somebody's hand and like a kilt or whatever warrior outfit they're going to wear, and just call it a day. And I think that is just lazy. That's also fantasy that I don't want to read. I think that like what I'm craving is diverse. I don't like using the term own voices, but like own voices, fantasy, with romance, with romance as the A plot. And
that's tricky. Not just because we need more, right? We need diverse books, but also because the romance piece feels tacked on so often with fantasy, right? Because it is a B plot or a C plot.
Is it because is the quest plot and a romance plot, are they mutually exclusive?
They're supposed to be separate. So usually, okay, in the original hero's journey by Joseph Campbell, right, the thing that Star Wars is based on, right? A young farm boy goes out into the world. Women, aka love, or just sex, depending on who's writing the book.
Well, they're probably going to die by then. Let's
probably
be
a man.
Yeah,
right. They are something to be attained.
Yes.
In the hero's journey, and the hero's like path to, questum and finding a ring or whatever. I don't know. But when you have in the fantasies that I've been reading by women, that the romance happens a little bit earlier, but it's also like such a small detail, or like there's one scene and then that's it. And I get it. I know it's like everybody hates romance and everybody hates YA. And
wait. But everybody doesn't hate romance, right?
No.
So what
publishers,
is it?
I think this is what somebody explained it to me as was it you?
Maybe. Let's say yes. Is it smart?
Okay. Is it smart? Somebody, because I've had this conversation. Why don't we have more romance fantasy, like high fantasy from traditional publishers? It's there in indie pub, but it's not there in traditional publishing as much. Why? And somebody told me possibly Sarah McLean, that romance readers will give a chance to most books if there's a promise of romance, but sci-fi readers, fantasy readers won't read something because there's romance in it.
Yes, that was me for sure.
It's directional, right? Exactly.
And yet, Sarah J. Maas's last book sold 25,000 copies in print first week.
More than that.
According to Publishers Weekly.
Yeah.
According to Publishers Weekly.
Feels like more than that. Yeah, but okay, so here's my thing. And I think I've said this before on the podcast on other episodes, but like sometimes there's a book, right? And I think we have to sort of name check Sarah J. Maas and say like, these books from the start, from like the beginning of her career, she has been able to just like knock it out of the park with readers. Like she delivers home run after home run after home run, right? To a very specific kind of reader who is looking for a very specific kind of book, right? Mm-hmm. And these are what I would call high fantasy.
They are
right?
high fantasy, yes.
I mean, I just read the most recent one.
A Court of
Silver Flames.
Yeah.
And it's like hot. It's super sexy. I want to get to sex in a minute. But like she breaks a lot of these like these rules of like what can and cannot make a fantasy, in that like these books are romance novels start to finish.
Yes.
They're just like big ones.
You know, I do want to say you already have Amanda Boucher, but that's already one series.
And they're not the same. They're not sexy.
They're not as sexy.
But let me just finish what I was saying about Sarah. So I do think sometimes when you're talking about somebody like Sarah, who is like just sort of blowing the doors off, she's like stratospheric in some way. You kind of have to like leave her out of the conversation in many ways because
she's the exception and not the rule.
Right.
That's what it feels like. No one else seems to be able to recreate the magic of a court of whatever and whatever.
But you have to remember that she's been building toward this for over a dozen books, right? It started with Throne of Glass, her YA.
But those early ones, that series also sold
absolutely
bananas.
But I mean, I think YA fantasy.
I'm not criticizing. By the way, I'm saying like
no.
There's some magic that she has that like I wish I had that magic.
Speculative fiction in YA is a very big deal.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't feel like that is those do not seem as mutually exclusive as fantasy and romance stuff.
And I think that like fantasy and YA has romance. There's just no sex on the page, for the most part. There is
except for in these books.
The court books are not YA to me because the characters are they're 1920, like they're not YA.
Kids are reading them.
Sold like YA, and kids are not. So like this is a whole different.
That's a whole different topic.
But like,
they were sold as new adult.
Yeah,
but I remember in those Throne of Glass. Those first ones were sexy. And I remember teenage girls saying like, oh my God, like they're so, like kind of glomming onto them the way, Jen and I glommed onto romance when we discovered it when we were a certain age too.
Yes.
Right? Like there's that sort of, ooh, this is kind of delicious.
It is.
It makes me feel things.
She was right. Because I think Sarah J. Maas had more explicit sex in her I didn't read her first trilogy, her first series, excuse me. So I don't know. I have heard, what's in
they have
them, but I think that because she sort of pioneered the ultra sexy in YA, there was almost a little bit of like it trickled down into other series, right? But there are very much like angsty, slow, super slow burn fantasies in YA, like Marie Rakowski, her series, the Winner's Curse, which is like a trilogy that I read in less than 3 days because I could not stop.
Delicious,
right? Such incredible tension. Like I just wanted them to kiss, and Mary E. Pearson's The Kiss of Deception, which has like a love triangle that I absolutely adore. And those books are like 700 pages long. And I still manage to read all of them in a day, like each one in a separate day, because of that romantic tension. But still, it wasn't like the explicit sex in the Court of Thorn, the other,
And this is where it gets into that conversation about like the sex piece, right? Which is in, of course, romance, tied up in the romance often. I mean, not always, but often when you're looking at an A plot that is a romance, because for it to be a good romance, it has to be either simultaneously both fantasy, like the journey, the quest, and the romance, a la Milla Vane's Heart of Blood and Ashes, right? Or it has to be romance first, quest second. Like, I'm thinking of somebody like, Thea Harrison's Dragonbound, like those Elder Races novels are very like romance first, quest second.
Right.
And then we get into, but then those books aren't called fantasy anymore. They're called paranormal. And they're like thrown into the corner. I mean, they're not in the corner, right? Because for many, many years, they were like keeping romance afloat, right? But they're thrown sort of off to the side as like, well, they're not part of the fantasy circle. If you went to the fantasy section of a bookstore, you wouldn't find paranormal romance in that section. You'd find it over in romance.
In romance.
You find Cressley Cole in romance.
Yes.
Despite the fact that like every book is a quest, there's a giant world. Right?
Yeah.
Like,
paranormal to me is urban fantasy with romance. Right? That's what it always has been to me. And I don't read as much of it as I do high fantasy because I just want to get lost in that world. Like Danielle Jensen's The Bridge Kingdom, right? I want that. That was the last one where I was just like, holy crap, this is a cool fantasy world with rules and stakes and kingdoms and like a hate to love that is just really delicious.
So, but what's the difference, I guess? I'm just going to ask. I'm asking because I want to like probe on that.
Yeah.
So is it because you, Zoraida, prefer high fantasy to contemporary fantasy? Or is it like that you, Zoraida, are looking for like a big giant world? Because paranormal does deliver that.
Paranormal has to create a brand new magical system for me to be like, oh, that's not like every other magical system I've already read, which fantasy has to do too.
I see.
But I think paranormal, right. I mean, I get it. Like paranormal is kind of like if you're going to read a shifter romance, a lot of that is just like, what to get. There's not really a whole lot of new things. Or, I mean, okay, like let's talk about IAD, for example. I mean, it's 18 books in and like, listen, the accession hasn't really started yet.
But interestingly, like at the beginning of that season, when we started the podcast, I told Zoraida, like, oh my God, you got to read these books. And they didn't land the same way for her that they landed for us. Likely because she's like, what the hell? This world is like, has no good rules.
Right.
Which we now know, right? Like we've talked about how Cressley retcons a lot of stuff in the later books.
I think fantasy, like when you go on for so long, you sort of have to break your own rules and retcon, though. I do think that.
Well, I mean, you're a Star Wars writer. Like that's a perfect example of like
a burn.
No, but just the Star Wars world is.
Star Wars does retcon things. Yes,
it doesn't have. You don't have a choice when you're writing something that's 40 years old. You just can't.
Yeah.
Right.
How do you surprise your reader? You make them fucking angry. Palpatine.
Yeah.
Don't get me started. What Raylo could have been if it had been written by a woman.
But I also think, but it also sounds like paranormal and sex have something that fantasy romance, I mean, or no.
No, see, like, I think that fantasy can have sex. Sure. There are a lot of, like, the dudes writing high fantasy, which I generally don't read because, like, there's, like,
say no more.
Too much rape. It's very rapey and, like, rape. Whatever. But they write sex in it, and I but it's not romantic.
That's what I mean. It's not a romance.
Right.
Because like Jamie and
Sex
whatever,
happening
sister
is
fuckers can happen, but like
right.
that's not sex. Like what's his name? That very tall Dutchman who was also in Game of Thrones. What's his name?
I don't know.
Help me.
Dutch.
I know.
Wait,
What?
maybe he's not
Pedro
Dutch.
Pascal, the Mandalorian, is in Game
Are
of
you
Thrones.
talking about Jason Momoa?
No, shush.
Sorry.
It's coming.
Dutch.
I know.
No,
he's a very
Nikolai
tall man.
Coster-Waldau.
Oh yeah,
Right?
Yeah,
He
yeah.
has this like beautiful potential. There's like this hint at like a real love story.
A real love story with
And
with
then
Brienne.
they destroy it. They just
Yeah, they
break it in half.
Right.
Oh
'cause
wait, that is Jamie Lannister.
that's Jamie Lannister.
And he goes back to his sister, and they die together. Spoilers, everyone. Sorry,
He died
but-
protecting the woman he loved. That was a terrible British accent, but yeah.
I mean, but that's a romance novelist would never.
Right. But I mean,
Whatever.
I want to talk about this because I feel like one of the bargains in a romance, like fair or not, is that the sex is transformative. Right. And once your main characters have that sex, it changes them in some way. Right. Moving forward. And in fantasy, that doesn't necessarily, sex doesn't have to have that role.
But also,
So-
love is the quest in romance.
Love is the
right?
quest.
Right.
So there's a book called A Song of Blood and Stone by L. Penelope. It's part of the Earth Singer Chronicles. And it's like there's a huge division, sort of like thing separating these two kingdoms. And there is fantasy racism, but the cultures are built really beautifully. The author is a Black woman. And she has a love story that has a really good payoff for me, because by the time it showed up, I was like, I wanted them to get together and now they're boning. I'm so happy. And nobody had told me that this book had a romance in it. It's still a B plot, but I was like, if somebody had told me this book had a romance, like a prominent romance, I would have read it 3 years ago.
So is it patriarchy? I mean, is it the same reason
why
that nobody pays attention to romance?
Why
Like,
don't fantasy
as a genre?
readers want romance in their fantasy?
I do think that readers want it. I think readers want it so much.
So
but
what's the problem?
the publisher is the publisher there. I think the problem is publishers. Are they going to publish? What is the life? You guys were talking about lifespans of mass market and trade and all these things. And so in another episode, and so our romance readers going to pay $28 for a hardcover that comes out for a high fantasy from a high fantasy publisher? Are they going to pay $20 for this?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Because most
get it.
sci-fi and
Other people
fantasy doesn't go to mass market.
Right.
No, and this is the crazy thing, right? Because it feels to me like you could do it and serve both markets,
Sure.
right? Like you could serve high fantasy readers kissing, right? Like I struggle with anybody being like, no, I don't want romance as a like significant plot. It doesn't have to be and I mean, I appreciate I'm not the like, but it does feel like
I want an A plot.
Renee Ahdieh, her books are big, beautiful romances.
Her first series, I forgot. Hold on. I don't want to say it. Look it up.
Wait, wasn't her first one the retelling of the Shahrazad?
Shahrazad, yeah.
Which
Her new series does not have as much romance as people claim it does. But
The Wrath and the Dawn is what we're talking about.
Renee Ahdieh's The Wrath and the Dawn is an example of YA that has a very powerful love story. That's the A plot, because the point is that she has to seduce the guy.
Yeah.
That's why it's a romance. That's why it's romance as an A plot.
As a romance novelist, right? We have to have a reason for the love story to happen too.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's just good writing. Like if you're putting a romance in the book as an A plot or a B plot or a C plot, like it should have a reason. These two people should, or multiple people, however many people there are, should have a reason for falling in love by the end. So yeah, I mean, and that series, the Wrath and the Dawn series, was really popular.
Yeah.
But I mean, and we also forget there's like Twilight, which I know we're kind of not allowed to talk. We're not supposed to talk about it as a YA, like in YA, but
It is YA.
it's YA, and it was there, and it was a juggernaut, right? So,
I don't like when people talk about it as like the foundation of YA, because YA existed for decades before that.
no, but it was a juggernaut. It did,
But
change
it changed the way that people dole out advances in publishing. It changed, it did change a lot of, I think, structurally, how voice impacts characters, like character-driven novels like that.
Well, and for like years, you could not throw a stone without hitting a love triangle in YA, right?
I still
for
think,
sure.
And it was
that's
all
really-
like
yeah.
big kind of fantasy books with a love triangle in them. And so for a while, that was what YA was delivering, and maybe still is, but it feels like that's sort of also not fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the love triangle.
Twilight's paranormal, right?
Sure. I would also just say like the love triangle in YA exists out in every, right? Because it's always about like who you are.
Right.
Right.
Not
It fulfills two different parts of what you need.
Right.
I have a tiny love triangle in my Holocrown duology, Incendiary, Illusionary. But Incendiary is like a political espionage high fantasy, and there's an allusion to romance. Book 2, Illusionary, is a straight up like romance is like the A plot and B plot are entwined.
In the second book.
In the second book, the romance and the quest are necessary in order to get to the end of the book.
Did you plan it that way? Were you like, I'm going to start and like appeal to fantasy? It's like straight fantasy readers.
Oh, and then
I'm going to write the love story and sort of trick them into loving that.
Because I did not do that. That feels like a smart strategy.
Well, there it is for the next series.
Next series. So I think that the reason why that happened was because if I was able to have the prince in book 1 more, it would have been more like the romance would have taken up more time. But because the way that you get to know the prince is through memories and that she steals, that my main character steals, and he becomes this composite that she doesn't know what to make sense of. You don't truly get to know him. You know him through secondhand. It's like getting to know somebody through story. And so who is this real person? And you get to know who he is in book 2. And one of the best compliments I ever received was like a reader who told me that she started shipping the prince and my main character with the prince only having like 3 scenes appearing only.
That's a romance reader.
That's a romance.
That's a romance reader.
Right, exactly.
And so book 2 is just a straight up romance love story, right? And that's what I wanted to write, and that's what I needed to write because I wrote this book during pandemic.
Yeah. Can I ask another question? And this is more like because I am not a very good reader of high fantasy. I get distracted and don't pay attention to like the world building. But so like low fantasy is perfect for me because I'm like, oh, okay, I get New York. Now I just have to like pay attention to this other thing. I don't have to understand it all. But one of the other things that strikes me as being potentially like kind of tied into world building is like, I feel like in fantasy, there's like generations. Right? Like time is another really important factor. So I'm thinking about there's The Daughters of Saria by Elizabeth Grace. Like it essentially is they're like angels. Like Lilith is like kind of has some daughters but like the first book is like 1587, but then like book 4 is like now, which I think is like a really cool thing that you can do in fantasy is like the way that people interact with like their ancestors or their descendants feels like you can build that into a romance, into like a fantasy in a way that is harder to do. Like, in a contemporary romance, like, yeah, you have siblings or parents, but like the weight of the way that like culturally plays out, is that true? Or is that just like something I don't know. Like I think even about Game of Thrones or whatever. Right. So
Like family?
Yeah, or just like time.
I mean, I think that there are some families that are some stories that are more epic
Okay.
that take up more
Epic.
space.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Fond du Lis, Jade City. That's it. Like, it's all about generations and families and this like holding on to power as a family.
Yeah.
It doesn't have romance. It has like a couple of sex scenes in book 2, but like the romance, I was just like, this is such a great opportunity. This like the head of this mob family chose like a girl with no name and like no magic. Like, this, could have been. Those books are still fantastic.
Or even like in Star Wars, like I grew up on, like Princess Leia and Han Solo, but then like the way you can like then expand that world is like you add a generation so it also seems like because the world is there, right? Like if you build some kick-ass world in fantasy, it seems to
you want to stay.
Yeah, you want to stay and your readers want to stay.
That's true. I mean, look at, and again, back to Sarah J. Maas, right? She has several sisters. And so after the trilogy with the first couple, you get the sister stories.
Which is, again, a real, like, romance. It's
very
Sarah
romantic thing, yeah.
We know, right, that Sarah J. Maas is a really huge romance fan, too.
Yes, that's true.
So you can see it. So is Renee. Like, you can really see it in some writers.
Yeah.
The writers that really push the romance forward.
Yeah. I feel like this is something that people have been calling for a lot more. And I think that with the new generation of editors that are coming up, I had this conversation with my editor who edited my Inheritance of Orchidia Divina, right? That publisher, Atria, publishes like so much romance. And I'm like, and you guys have some fantasy, but why don't you have both? And I feel like I'm given the answer, not from her, but from other people who are like, oh, nobody's writing it. And I refuse to believe that because I think that there are people writing it, but I want these expansive worlds by POC, by queer people. Like, where are they?
I think sometimes that gets said so many times that writers internalize like what you can and cannot do, right? So like if you want to sell, a fantasy the way N.K. Jemisin sold fantasy and just blew the doors off, you have to do it without sex. You have to do it without romance.
Right.
Or
this is something I want to ask.
Because if you do it with sex or with romance, then you have to be able to sell Sarah J. Maas levels of books.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. And it's a nonsense thing. Like, but we all go through it, right? Like in historicals, it's like, well, Scots don't sell as well as everything else,
or like or whatever.
If you put a book on a boat, you're going to sell fewer books, so maybe don't put a book on a boat. And the reality is, it's like it's lore,
right?
It's I think that the market is constantly changing, and the truth to me, after having been publishing since 2011, is that publishers don't actually know what the market holds because they don't create the market. Readers create the market. And so if there's enough of a demand and if something takes off, then you have the publishers who are playing copycat, right? The year that my Vicious Deep Mermaid series was bought was the year that every mermaid book was bought because trends chase each other.
Right.
But publishers don't create trends. Authors do. And if we realize that we have this power, we should just write whatever the fuck we want.
So get together with all your friends, Zoraida, and say, we're all going to write a romance plot next. So one of the other questions that I have, and one of the things that I was thinking about over the last week is when we talk about fantasy, I feel like there's something to, and it's sort of a half-baked question because I'm probably wrong, but there's this question of power, like meaning when the character has some sort of magical power or some sort of control or comes into his or her power, right? That feels like it's really hero's journey shit happening, right?
Yeah.
Like, but in romance, especially in adult romance, right? The power isn't often discovered it's already in the hands of the character at the beginning in a paranormal, say, right?
Okay.
So I've been thinking about like, where's the line in paranormal between, what makes a paranormal versus a fantasy? And I was thinking about Jasmine Silvera's Death Dancer, which is the first in a series. The heroine is a dancer, and it's set in sort of an alternate universe where dancing it is used to communicate with the gods. And there's, been a gods war, and essentially dancing is the way that people that cultures get close to gods. And the hero is a necromancer and needs a dancer to, whatever the thing is to do stuff. And so I think about that because I think in that particular book, the heroine knew, she's a dancer. She also was, I really love that she has, like a problem with her hip. And so she realizes that like very soon she is not going to be able to dance at the same level that she has been dancing. And he finds her, and he feels like she is the dancer that he needs in order to get his necromancing business done. And I think that in her case, she doesn't fully understand how powerful she is as a dancer. And I think that feels somewhere in there is the difference is the line for me on, magic in paranormal versus magic in fantasy.
I think that it just really depends on where the character is starting. And maybe this is a choice that people just make, because I don't think every high fantasy needs to be a quest.
Okay.
Right? There are others journeys aside from the hero's journey, because the hero's journey is about change. But if a character, like if a high fan, I'm failing, that's the thing though, like I'm failing to come up with.
I mean, we've talked about Gail Carriger's The Heroine's Journey, which is about community building as opposed to
Have you read that?
I have not read hers, but I have read Maureen Murdoch's The Heroine's Journey, which was a response. It might be based on Maureen Murdoch, but Maureen Murdoch's was a response to Joseph Campbell saying that like women should go on the hero's journey, and it is that women create community. So, but I think that Maureen Murdoch's might be the predecessor of whatever Gail Carriger is doing.
Yeah, there are other journeys, but maybe that's that's a piece of it too. Fantasy just hasn't sort of, I don't know, but it feels like it must.
Mm-hmm. It must, and it has to
it's
somewhere.
gotten there in your hands, right?
I mean, yeah, but see, mine's about redemption, right? This girl already has the power, and she's already made mistakes with the power. So it's about redemption, and saving a kingdom. And I think that's why I don't spend a lot of there's a lot of questing, because I love quests personally. And maybe that's just why, like, the things that keep getting picked up are the thing, like, if we're all writing the things that we love and a lot of us loves quests, then, you're going to get a lot of these kinds of fantasies.
When you were, did you come to fantasy early?
I came to urban fantasy. So I started reading books about vampires since I was 13.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it does feel like all of us, right, who write genre. And that's what we're always talking about. And it's what you guys talk about on Deadline City so often is like,
yes,
this, sorry, we should have said that from the beginning. Zoraida and Danielle Clayton have a really wonderful writing podcast called Deadline City.
We have a lot of world building episodes if you guys want to listen to those.
Ooh, we'll link to them in show notes.
There's an episode where you talk about The Witcher, and I love it because you were talking, it came to The Witcher through a conversation about rules, like, and how if you set down rules, they have to be followed. And I think that's true of everything. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, at the beginning of this podcast was what you can learn from fantasy. And I do think, like, we all set down rules at the beginning of our books and we have to follow them. The characters have to follow their own rules.
Paranormal versus high fantasy. And I think to me, paranormal it's just that the rules are more tied to the real world. I feel like because paranormal is fantasy, it's just a subset of fantasy. And I think the reason why it does better, because it does better in adult. Like we haven't had a resurgence of paranormal in YA. And I think that the reason is why, because publishers they kept putting out the same book by different authors. And then there was nothing like answering the question, what's different about this? And I think that if, there's a call for a resurgence in vampire fiction. But again, like, are you just giving us the same vampire fiction as before? Because if you are, then it's not going to do well because people have already read that book. So what's going to be different about this time around? And so I think that, like, I don't know. I feel like there are a lot of missed opportunities in fantasy. I mean, there's a book that somebody keeps recommending to me, called Cushion's Dart. I don't know if you've read it.
Oh yeah, that's like a prototypical.
People recommend it a lot.
Like,
Yeah.
That's
by
like the
Jacqueline
primordial
Carey.
fantasy.
And it's like fantasy, and it has apparently has romance in it.
It's not the least problematic book you've ever read. But it's a fantasy. It is, when you say fantasy romance, like the first book that comes to my mind is Cushion's Dart, but it's old and,
it's from
carries all the weight that older romances carry.
Right. It's from 2001. So that's like a million years ago by now. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know. I feel like there has to be an answer. I'm trying to work on it because I need this. I hate when I have like unsolvable problems because no problem is truly unsolvable. And so the answer is like, I'm just going to write what I want to read.
I do think that, to your point about, are people going to spend $28 on, a fantasy romance when they could, spend $7 on it?
Right.
I think that what we're seeing happen in trade with romantic fiction, right? In trade is they're putting the books out in trade, and they are romances mostly. But they have less sex, and they're more expensive, and I hate to phrase it this way, but they're tricking contemporary fiction, like commercial fiction readers, into reading romance. They're not pulling the reader through to romance, right? They're saying, you like this, and it's different than everything that's over here.
Right.
Okay.
And it's less sexy and it's more expensive. And I think it's because publishing is, I keep coming back to, it's because publishing is ashamed of romance too.
Right.
Right? Everybody's ashamed of kissing.
I feel like my editor for Illusionary at Little Brown did encourage me to, I was like, I'm just going to put a ton of romance in here. And she was like, that's great. I want to hear that.
Obviously when we say like publishing is ashamed of romance, we don't mean like every person.
No, not every person. But I do think that like, I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where they're not. And so the question is like, what are agents going to do to acquire, like who's in charge of making these changes? Are the writers, because writers are writing it.
But I think, again, writers, it's scary out here as a writer, right? Like, you and I have been around for a long time. We've written a lot of books, the two of us. And I still set out my plan for the book that I'm writing and think to myself, like, oh, but if this doesn't work, like, is that the end of Sarah McLean? And it's like, so I think that there is but it feels much more intense almost for fantasy writers because you guys are working with like big series.
Right.
And if you have one that sort of blows the doors off, you have to repeat the
that, right?
You
Repeat
have
the
to do
magic.
it again.
Yeah.
And if you can't do it the exact same way and get the exact same, huge sales numbers, huge attention, you have to like go live in a cave.
Yeah. And then come back with a different pen name, come back with, yeah.
I mean, it's different than romance, right? Like we have to do it too. Like we have to hit the bell every time too, but it's a different kind of fear. I think.
For me, I feel like I'm still trying to find that sweet spot where there's a series that like, I don't think I'm going to write a series. I think I'm going to write like one huge epic standalone, just full with romance and magic and see how that works, because I'm sort of like, as a mid-list author, people are still buying my books, but I think I get a little bit more of a leeway into I'm still able to explore what I want to explore without like reader expectation.
Right. Like there's some freedom in that too.
Because people are still discovering me. Yeah, there's more freedom in that. And I think that the people who already know me know that it's like, okay, I'm going to get magic. I'm going to get some sort of family dynamic, and I'm going to get romance. But that's something that I've been building for years.
Right.
And so, yeah, we'll see what happens, since now I'm out of contract and have to figure out how I'm going to feed myself.
I'm not worried. You'll be able to sell more books.
You're going to be amazing. Can we wrap up, though, with some of your favorite fantasy romances, things that you do think would qualify? I know you've mentioned some kind of throughout the course of the episode, but I feel like, outside of A Heart of Blood and Ashes, I mostly end up reading paranormal. So are there some that you think our listeners would want to read?
I mean, they're mostly YA at this point, right? Like the Kiss of Deception trilogy by Mary E. Pearson is fantastic. El Penelope's series, The Earthsinger Chronicles, it's up to 4 books now, and there are different couples in each book, so you don't follow the same couple the whole time. Marie Rakowski's The Winner's Curse is still one of my favorite YA trilogies that has one of the best slow burns ever. In adult, The Bridge Kingdom by Daniel Jensen, which is a hate to love. It started off as an audiobook original, and it's about a princess who essentially has to get rid of all her sisters in order to be chosen to save her kingdom by marrying an enemy king. And she has to like deceive him and seduce him, but she falls in love, obviously. And it's pitch perfect. It's so good. And I haven't clicked, immediately clicked a sequel so hard as I did that book. So that was really phenomenal. Sierra Simone's A Language in Thorns series, to me, is speculative because it has that like sex magic. But it's also very, very kinky too. I love it. And it's beautifully written.
That's romancy. That's very romancy.
Oh, for sure. And I would consider that fantasy it under the speculative umbrella because of like the weird sex magic that happens. But it's, it's not high fantasy or anything like that.
And you brought up Amanda Boucher earlier.
Yeah. Amanda Boucher, yeah.
The first book in that is A Promise of Fire.
Yes. Yeah. So please give me more high fantasy romances.
Zoraida, tell everybody
about Illusionary and Incendiary, or the other way around. I mean, you mentioned them a little bit, but that's like your newest book, right? So you can also pitch Give us the elevator pitch on that.
So the Holocron duology is a high fantasy series. It is set in a world inspired by Inquisition Spain. It's about a girl with the ability to steal memories. And as a kid, she was used by the enemy king to steal memories from, people he wanted to know all their secrets. And she was used as a weapon. And because of that, her people, the Moria, a lot of them were killed. And so the book starts 10 years later, where she is now a rebel among her people, with her people, and she returns to, after the love of her life, and her commander gets taken. She returns to the palace to slit some throats and actually, get information and kill the prince whom she hates. Book 2, I would just be spoiling everything if I tell you book 2. Book 2 is a love story / quest, which continues Renata's story with said enemy prince.
She hates
and magical realism coming up in September.
In September, I have The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina.
And this cover is beautiful.
So gorgeous.
Yes.
And this book took me like 3-4 years to write. I sold it in 2017. It's finally coming out now. Oh my God. It's a family drama. I would pitch it as Practical Magic meets 100 Years of Solitude. Somebody told me that when they read it, they felt like it was like Knives Out meets Isabel Allende. And I was like, thank you.
That's amazing.
Nice.
Because there are a lot of family secrets. It's about 3 cousins who inherit their grandmother's very strange magic. And then when they get invited to their grandmother's death day, essentially funeral, their grandmother's still alive, but she's like, please come to the house. Please come to our homestead. I'm dying. And after their grandmother passes and they receive their inheritance, 7 years later, an unknown entity is killing off all of the family members. And so these 3 cousins have to return to Guayaquil, Ecuador, which is where I'm from, to figure out their grandmother's past and her very sordid past and what happened, what she did in order to get this magic, and how they're going to survive.
I can't wait to read it. I just realized we introduced ourselves, but we didn't say this was Fated Mates, but it is, in fact, Fated Mates. And if you love a high fantasy romance and you have recommendations, share them with Zoraida and with us on Twitter and Instagram. Now tell everybody, Zoraida, where they can find you.
You can find me on Twitter. I tweet way too much. I'm at...
Same, girl, same.
the phrase Z like in Zorro. And my other personality, Zoey Castile, Zoey with a Y, Castile with 1 L. And on Instagram, I'm Zoraida Solo, like Han Solo. So that's where I spend most of my time.
Nice. Thank you so much for coming and teaching us about fantasy.
I hope I was helpful. And I know that there are a lot of high fantasies in the indie pub space. And I think that I don't want to make anyone feel bad. I know that it's existing out there, but I do think that we need to put pressure on traditional publishers to give writers these opportunities and to show that put some respect in romance and that it does belong in high fantasy and other fantasies.
Considering you just talked about respect and romance, I feel I need to tell everybody that I'm currently reading a monster bordello romance. Fine. Called, I'm going to recommend it. I'm not done, so I apologize if it really goes off the rails by the end, but I'm really enjoying it. It's called A Lady of Rooksgrave Manor, and it's basically a heroine who really loves sex in some time in history is employed in a bordello that services monsters. Men who turn into monsters.
That sounds phenomenal.
And I'm really enjoying it. It is almost wall to wall monster fucking.
When we sign off of here, I need to tell you about my plans for the future.
Ooh, that
Which
sounds
may
exciting.
involve literal monster fucking romance.
Fine.
Anyway, this is Fated Mates. We are produced by Eric Mortensen. You can find us at fatedmates.net, where you can find transcripts and links to gear from Jordan Dene and links to Kelly, best friend Kelly's sticker club. And now there's a special
Yes. If you enter in Fated Mates into the coupon box or a note to her with your first shipment, she will add in a sparkly Fated Mate sticker, and I've seen them and they are awesome. So you definitely want one of those.
They're
want
amazing. Also at fatedmates.net, you can find all of the music from the show, which I'm sure this one will be
Amazing.
exciting.
Look, if Blood Sugar Sex Magic doesn't make it in there somewhere, I'm going to be
Love
real
that
mad.
song.
And that's it. Tell us about great fantasy romances that you've read. We will make sure that if you don't tag Zoraida, that she gets tagged so that her TBR pile also topples this week. We hope you're all reading great romance. And thank you, Zoraida, again.
Blood sugar baby, she magic, a sex magic, a sex magic. Blood sugar baby, she magic, a sex magic, a sex magic. Blood sugar crazy, she has it, a sex magic, a sex magic. Blood sugar